để lỡ pengai mà ước tam và bắt ước tam mà canal lệ lỡ sự của mà kia có thoại lệ đang ai ước tam để tập hợp lần ô đại diện mà thể mâng diện mà thể cái tông đại diện bắt làm nơ để rung còn cô cái đi đang và na bên cái đi độ lệ đã nấu bạc cái bên mâng đập.
Bodies needed saving too. Gordon Smith had seen the victims of leprosy, exiled from their home villages for fear of contagion, had seen them dying in jungle huts. To care for these people, he began construction of a leprosarium near Bahnar Tukrong.
January the 2nd, 1951, the first group of ragged and dusty men, women, and children afflicted with leprosy arrived at the new leprosarium in the trailer reserved for them. The first thing they received was a large piece of washing soap. Next, a warm woolen blanket and a grass mat were given to each one, and they were shown to their living quarters in the longhouse.
One of our American missionary nurses taught at Rad A to be a lab technician. See, that's the purpose of our mission, to work ourselves out of jobs.
There's one room called the foot wash room. That's one that I remember more than any, because that really kind of horrified me to see them being treated with their feet, but because they bleed and they cut these ulcers away and all, and you would think that they would really be in pain, but because they have leprosy, they don't have any pain, and they just sit there and talk to the nurses. They were taking care of their feet.
Gordon Smith wanted the leprosarium to be self-sufficient. The patients dammed a stream and cleared fields so they could grow their own vegetables. The facility expanded quickly, but not quickly enough to take in all those who needed help.
We give him a shirt and some soap to take back. We want to enter now, she says. We cannot walk back again all that way. We want to be healed. It breaks our hearts to have to send them away.
In 1954, the wind of change blew through the highlands yet again. The French, defeated at Dien Bien Phu, departed. The South Vietnamese government started moving ethnic Vietnamese into the highlands in an effort to assimilate the Montagnards.
What we were seeing at that time was the threat, the way the Montagnards perceived a threat to their cultural identity by the policies of the South Vietnamese government. And they really were feeling very threatened. And they cited endless examples of how this was happening. Things like the name of the towns were changed. They were all Montagnard names or based on Montagnard names. And the Vietnamese made them all Vietnamese names. Endless things. And Gordon understood this and would exchange information with me. But as a missionary, you see, he had to play a very careful role because he couldn't come out and openly criticize the government because they would have kicked him out of the highlands. He had no legal status of any sort.
In 1956, Gordon Smith's independent ways caught up with him. Mission headquarters in the United States objected to his independent fundraising for the leprosarium. He resigned, but he didn't leave. He and Laura simply moved north to the coastal city of Da Nang and started a new Bible school of their own. Gordon Smith lived on the coast now, but still his heart was in the highlands, the Montagnard regions where few Westerners had ever set foot.
Gordon was setting up a mission in the Katu country. Now, the French had never really gotten into the country and pacified it, which is the term they used during the colonial period. And so he suggested that I go with him on one of the trips. So he organized a trip in August 1957 into the Katu country. And we started in, and it was incredibly hot. It was hot and steamy. As we were approaching the village, I noticed these things along the path. They were taboo signs, I was sure. Well, it turned out the village had a stockade, and the front door, the gate of the stockade was closed. And so we went into the village, and all the people had gotten into their houses and pulled the shutters. They were all peeking out at us. We went to the men's house, and the chief was sitting on a mat in the men's house with these young men, warriors, standing behind him, and their loincloths and very long hair and these 10-foot-long spears with these huge blades that they use for the blood sacrifices, the human blood sacrifices. What you do is dip the spears in the human blood after you kill the victim. Well, this this was very unsettling, to say the least. Gordon was very forthright about the whole thing and said, I think we might have outdone ourselves. I said, I hope you're wrong. I said, but all the while, I said, remember, my friends, smile, smile, smile at the natives. Anyhow, the chief was very unfriendly. He said, I don't want any Frenchmen in the village. They thought all Westerners were French. And then we said, well, why not? And he said, the Viet Minh, now that's the old term for the Viet Cong, the communists. He said the Viet Minh wouldn't like it. We said, are there any Viet Minh here? And he said, yes, they're in the forest. So anyhow, we left that village and we went to another village where they didn't have a stockade. And it turned out it had been two villages, but the sickness and lack of food had made life so difficult for the people that they decided to perform blood sacrifices. And Gordon explained to him that he had a boat coming up the river with some rice, a larger boat, and a nurse was on board the boat. We couldn't explain what a nurse was because they had no idea what a nurse was. In fact, they had never seen clothes like we were wearing. They'd never seen watches. They'd never seen cameras.
Near Da Nang, Gordon Smith founded a new leprosarium. American GIs were coming into Vietnam now, trying to make friends in the countryside. He welcomed them, and they pitched in to help construct the new building.
Gordon wanted the leprosarium to be not just an institution. He wanted it to be a place where the people were going to be very happy and, you know, develop a good outlook on life, and not feel threatened. And then he wanted to make sure that the buildings were all placed well, so they were all going to be kind of pleasant and kind of very nice. It's like planning a resort in a way, you know, a very posh resort.
It was a lovely dream. But in 1962, the Vietnam War intruded violently into the missionary lives. Betty Mitchell's husband, Archie, was kidnapped from the leprosarium in Bahnar Tukrong.
You could hear their boots on the ground, and they were yelling, "Village people, get out, come on out, come on out." And we didn't have time to get out, really. They took their bayonets and cut the screen and jumped in and took my husband and tied him up. And then they, by the time I went out to there, I saw them taking him out. The children came in to me, and then they came in to get me too, and took me out and started to tie me. They'd already tied him behind his back, with his arms behind his back. And then he said, and they started leading him away. And then they said to him, he said to them, "Don't take her, let her stay with the children." And they started leading him away. Even though it's many years since, and I've never had direct contact with Archie, I still have hope. Now, one thing that the tribal people would say to us, you know, you Americans are different than we are. This is our country. We live here, and if the war comes, we have to stay. But if it comes to you, you know, you can leave. You don't have to stay. Well, I felt that I really learned a lot after my husband was captured by the communists, and I didn't leave because I knew God didn't want me to leave. I was to stay there to be with them and to help them. And this sort of opened the door. They sort of took me in then that I was part of them, because I had suffered like some of them had suffered, like many of them had suffered.
The war was getting worse and more violent, and more mountaineers were going as refugees, leaving their villages, abandoning the villages, flooding into other villages, into the forest. What it did really was disrupt their adaptations, their farming, their way of life. Everything was badly disrupted. And also they were caught between the conflicting forces, which was really very deadly. The American-South Vietnamese bombing, the use of herbicides, some of the groups were badly affected by that. The communists would attack buses and the roads. Then they started attacking villages at night, and a great many people died.
Montagnard villagers were evacuated to create free fire zones in which any person moving could be considered an enemy. In large relocation camps, the Montagnards were supposed to be housed and fed and protected.
What happened is that the resettlements were badly organized. The Vietnamese are the ones who were supposed to implement them, and the money was stolen. The houses didn't get built. They moved the people in soil that the Montagnards didn't know how to farm. They, by and large, were disastrous. I can't think of any of them that were successful. So the poor Montagnards would get fed up, and they'd pack up and move back to where they came from, in which case they were in the free fire zone. And so they were subject to bombing and shelling and what have you there. And these things happened all the time.
Before the war, every family has a small house with a stock of rice. And during the war, and then you have to go to a strategic hamlet, that stock of rice is destroyed. And then that is where the Montagnards begin to be hungry.
The missionaries tried to bring comfort to the Montagnard refugees. Gordon Smith's son, Stanley, opened a small church with his wife, Jenny, and started a school for refugee children. It was dangerous work. Several of the Vietnamese pastors with whom Stanley Smith worked were killed by the Viet Cong. Of course, by now, thousands of people were dying in the war. Gordon and Laura Smith turned their attention to the orphans who were left behind. They helped organize a network of orphan homes in the highlands, and at a spectacular site on China Beach near Da Nang, they built their largest orphanage. Nguyen Van Minh grew up in the Smith's orphanage on China Beach.
Khi tôi được 10 tuổi thì được các giáo sĩ và các truyền đạo.
When I was 10 years old, I entered the orphanage near Da Nang, and it was a result of the kindness of the missionaries. I was a young boy, working almost like a slave. I had a mother, but my father was a French soldier who was no longer with us. I was an orphan and was taken care of very kindly at the China Beach orphanage. My memories at the orphanage were very fine, especially because I sensed love, especially from Mrs. Laura Smith. And to put it shortly, it was just that we were treated well. It was a very good experience.
The missionaries faced war bravely, but in 1968, when the Tet Offensive swept across the country, war simply overwhelmed them. The mission compound Gordon Smith had built at Bahnar Tukrong was attacked by the Viet Cong.
They threw a grenade in the bunker where I was with 3 other missionaries. And they were killed outright. They were close to the entrance. I was in a corner. So I had quite a few, what do you call them, shrapnel wounds. I thought I was dying, so I was forced to come out with a little tribes boy who had been injured too. And went across the road, and that's when I saw my husband. I saw him slumped over a clothesline. He was shot point blank, big cap. So I'm sure there was an instant of fear, but he had no pain.
Bob Ziemer and 6 other missionaries were killed in the attack. Marie Ziemer recovered from her wounds. She left Vietnam and never returned. The Smiths' leprosarium on a remote beach with no roads to it was preserved from the horrors of the war for a few more years. But on October 6, 1972, it was devastated by a sudden attack. Laura Smith wrote,
"It was a pitiful sight. Gordon and I wept over the cruel attack. On the grass, the wounded were lying on a few stretchers or bloody mattresses with blankets covering them. Most of them were poor patients already badly mutilated with their leprosy. But now, all of this suffering and misery was added."
1 woman was killed, several patients wounded, almost every building destroyed. The patients had no other place to go. They could only rebuild and stay there. The U.S. Armed Forces sent donations. Marine General Lewis Walt helped raise money to ferry wounded orphans to the United States for surgery. And then one day, Laura Smith was able to write,
It's January 28th, 1973. All of a sudden, the guns are silent. It's eerie and uncertain. The nightly booming of artillery has ceased. The roaring of jets has dwindled to almost nothing. And the small arms fire around Da Nang has given way to an uneasy peace. The ceasefire is here. By now, the U.S. Armed Forces have all gone from Vietnam. We saw the Japanese and French leave years ago. We surely miss the many American officers and men who, through the past 10 years, have been good friends to our work and staunch supporters. Now their great sprawling camps and bases are filled with tens of thousands of refugees, and the huge Da Nang Air Base seems almost deserted.
Gordon Smith had devoted 45 years of his life to the highland people of Vietnam. He felt they needed him now more than ever. But he was 72. He had a failing heart. In 1974, Gordon and Laura Smith abandoned their mission home and returned to the United States. Their son Stanley remained to carry on, but the ceasefire soon unraveled. Viet Cong and North Vietnamese troops began their final assault. The battle turned to a rout, and Stanley Smith, his wife and 4 children, barely managed to escape from Da Nang.
What really happened was almost a chaos. Vietnamese by the hundreds, even thousands, were coming over the fence into the airport, and then there was kind of a stampede. We actually had to run to the truck, and we made our way to this World Airways plane that had been chartered by the embassy to evacuate us. The engines were running, and it was a 727 Boeing. We were told to quickly get up on that plane, and as we went up the steps, the last person was up. Even before the last person was up, the pilot started taxiing out to the runway because he could see many other people coming and trying to get on the same flight.
Refugees poured out of Vietnam. Gordon and Laura Smith offered sponsorship in the United States to as many as they could. Gordon Smith sought to send relief supplies to Vietnam. He sought to return himself.
Even despite the fact that he knew that he had cancer, up until the time he died in '77, he was still trying to negotiate to get back to Vietnam to be with his people. It was something that struck me as to show the great dedication that he had, both for mission work, but also for the great love he had for the people of Vietnam, both the Highland people and the Vietnamese.
Laura Smith lived on for 2 more years. She raised support for missionary activities until the day she died in 1979, 50 years from the time of her arrival in Croatier as a young wife and devoted missionary. And what became of it all? The orphanage and the leprosarium and the dreams of Gordon and Laura.
We've just landed at Bahnar Tukrong City. Would you please remain seated until the train comes to complete stop?
After 15 years of trying, Stanley and Jenny Smith returned to Vietnam in 1990.
Jenny and I were real happy to be able to go back to see how we might be able to be re-involved. We also wanted to portray to our Vietnamese co-workers and friends that we had not forgotten them.
And they were not forgotten. From all over the country, old colleagues and friends joined them for an emotional reunion.
Even though we're physically far apart, we are together in prayer. Dear Lord, thank you for taking care of us through difficult times.
Life had been hard. There were stories to tell of death and imprisonment. Nguyen Van Men, who grew up in the China Beach orphanage, has become an evangelist himself.
Tôi đã bị tù vì người ta khi vào Kon Tum.
I was imprisoned in 1975. When the revolution became successful, they felt that anyone like me could not be a part of a new society. The government felt that I had been involved with the Full Row movement, which is a movement among some mountain people. But this was untrue. I had never been an agent for the American government. I have never been involved with this movement for separation from the central government. But I was falsely accused, and I had to go to jail for 12 years.
The churches founded by Gordon Smith are closely watched by the Hanoi government, but they are open and self-sufficient, and their congregations are growing. The pastors think they have reason to hope for an end to the jailing and harassment they have suffered.
Indigenous church is what we want. That's what our mission has always stood for. And I have real hopes for the church to continue to grow, both here and in Vietnam too, in spite of the problems. Under persecution, a lot of times the church is stronger, you know that.
And the leprosarium near Da Nang, into which Gordon Smith poured so much of his life and energy, it is still there. Stanley Smith was not allowed to visit it, but he was able to see it from a distance.
It looked like the buildings, for the most part, were intact. But even more importantly, we had heard that even though it was under the jurisdiction of the communist government, that they were doing a fair job with the leprosy ministry, and the leprosy patients themselves knew that we were in Da Nang and were expecting us to visit, and of course were quite disappointed when we did not go because of the lack of permission.
The war was deadly for the Montagnards. They lost their lives by the tens of thousands. Most of their villages were destroyed. Their culture was shattered. But here and there in jungle clearings, groups of them still come together regularly and reverently for Christian services. The seed Gordon Smith planted in these remote places remains stubbornly alive and growing. East and West collided violently in Vietnam, with many casualties. But those who remember Gordon and Laura Smith remember that East and West did not always collide. Once they touched.
Hãy subscribe cho kênh Ghiền Mì Gõ để không bỏ lỡ